When Neversoft was formed in 1994 by a bunch of ex-Malibu Comics employees, like a lot of new developers, it was a rough start before they got their first big break with Apocalypse. But while playing Top Skater regularly on trips to bowling, they made their first skateboarding prototype using the Apocalypse engine. Meanwhile, Tony Hawk was also pitching ideas for a skating video game and was highly impressed with Neversoft's build, and signed on as a namesake and consultant. While a new genre was being created, their namesake landed the 900 at the X Games. Basically, one of the best examples of being at the right place at the right time, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater became one of the games of the year in 1999. It turned Neversoft into an elite household name amongst developers, turned Tony Hawk into a celebrity, and skateboarding and all action sports were entering a glory period which no question shaped part of my general personality to this day. The initial expectations were that if the number of copies sold exceeded 250,000, it would be a profit for Activision and they were allowed to make a sequel. So a few months after the release of Pro Skater, Neversoft published an ad saying they were hiring developers for new projects, including, quote, Spider-Man THPS2 and PSX2 development. And a couple of weeks after that, Activision announced that they bought out Neversoft. With a year to make the sequel, they basically went through everything they wanted to do in the first game, with Joel Jewett describing it as a sequel and a half. And their next big challenge was about keeping things accessible to those new to the franchise because the predecessor blew up so much, while also setting things up for the returning fans planning to set high scores in the millions. Officially announced on April 2000, it was released on September for the PlayStation, although it received a special early launch in LA with Tony Hawk himself handing out autographed copies of the game. Like the predecessor, there are multiple ports out there, but once again we're looking at the PlayStation version. Now this is the one I call the game. The first time I saw it was on my cousin's PS1, this very console in fact, and I remember that he showed off a bonus demo called Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX. Yeah, that is my introduction to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, the demo and the settings. But it is one of the earliest gaming memories I can remember. It might be the first time I ever saw a Sony PlayStation. Anyway, even though there were others in the franchise, like I literally had the first 4 Tony Hawk titles all on the PS1 since I didn't get a PS2 until 2006, and what did that come bundled with? A Tony Hawk game, of course. And all of them were good, the PS1 version specifically, but always knowing there was a superior PS2 version for these ones always made me think I wasn't playing the best version. There was just something about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 that makes me like it the most. It was my introduction to the franchise for me, and along with riding motorbikes, being a fan of action sports, death-defying stunts, tribal decals, and a soundtrack which heavily shaped my music tastes. This is one of those rare games where I can name every single song performed by every artist in the back of my head. And as you can see here, I can't single out any of them because they're all memorable. The fact that it has all but 3 songs from the first 2 games in the 2020 remaster shows how important the music is to the franchise. In short, its mix of alternative punk and hip hop make for one of the best licensed soundtracks for any video game ever. No debate. Unfortunately, over the next few years when I did get a PS2, most of my PS1 collection just phased out, either lost or sold, regretfully in hindsight. I don't even remember what happened. Then I briefly had the mobile version of Pro Skater 2, which I was able to 100% the entire thing, hoping there would be skate heaven hidden somewhere, but there wasn't. By the way, that was a very good version of the game considering that the button commands were all touchscreen. But if there's any way to play this game, it'll always be the PlayStation version for me. Easily a top 10 all-time favorite of mine. So expect an extremely positive review on this video. It's easy to say that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 controls exactly the same as the first game. Quick summary, you have the options of flip, grab, and grind designed to every action button, and a special bar that allows you to perform hidden tricks that give you more points when filled up. Inspired by fighting games, it was radical at the time, but has gone on to become a timeless setup for any game of the action sport genre. However, thanks to the advancement of multiple titles in the series, playing the first game nowadays feels like the skaters weigh twice as much as they should and the momentum is weird. It's like a prototype of Pro Skater 2, and that Pro Skater 2 was the finished product. Just playing both games simultaneously for a minute, the sequel is clearly better. Even as a kid, it was obvious. But when you take a step back and look at it from a reviewer perspective, it actually amazed me on how much of a quantum leap they made after just a year. Did I mention Neversoft were also working on another game in between? You still need to correct yourself in position every once in a while since the camera doesn't exactly lock where you're moving when you're still. It's another game where I have the game mode turned on my TV when I play it, and for a lot of people, big drop is a glaring issue that should never have been implemented in the first place, but after all the hours I've put into this game and knowing the precise moment to press the jump button before landing, to me it's just another combo multiplier. Otherwise, this game is a lot easier to control, way less clunky somehow. Like, skaters are less likely to crash, more likely to respond to your button commands, the frame rate is smoother, and includes additional mechanics that respect skateboarding terminology. Things like perfect landings, nollies and fakies, and front, back, nose, tail, and blunt slides based on the direction you press on the D-pad. Even most of the default grab and flip tricks are assigned accordingly, similar to what the skate titles would utilize with the analog stick. I know it's an overly general way of describing this game, at least from my point of view. It's like describing the controls of a Super Mario or Call of Duty title. But Pro Skater 2 introduced all these features I just mentioned, and it allows for a more diverse lineup of tricks to perform, with the number of them tripling from the predecessor. This also means that every single pro skater has a different moveset based more closely on the type of skater they are, vert or street. And unlike the predecessor where all of them had either kickflip, McTwist, front flip or backflip as a special, each skater's special is unique to them. And thanks to the edit tricks option, you don't even have to look it up on the internet or try random button combinations, it's all there. Where you can also reassign and buy new tricks to your liking in the career mode. But the most important mechanic that would literally change the course of the franchise, the manual. Sounds simple, and was actually something the developers tried to implement in the predecessor. Let's just say if they did, based on the level designs and challenges, it would be the easiest game ever made. They tried a few button variations, but eventually went with pressing up and down on the D-pad before landing. And that's it. Whenever you're in the air, you can keep the combo going by pulling a manual or nose manual, which opened the window for some of the craziest high score numbers in a 2-minute window. Let me put it this way, with the way multipliers work, this setup here is better for scoring points than this. However, this makes the whole game a bit too easy, especially by the time the stats are maxed out. Though it might be just me because I played it so much, so of course I'm gonna not exactly score 2 million points in 30 seconds, but I am good enough that I expect to 100% goals and cash before advancing to the next level without distraction. I just think a harder difficulty for the goals and cash would have been a good idea. Similar to what Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 would implement, the more goals you completed, the harder they become. Like make the high scores over 1 million points or the collectibles harder to collect. Speaking of that, the career mode structure is almost identical from the predecessor. Select a pro skater with goals to complete in a 2-minute window and a few 3-heat competitions in between. The number of goals to complete is more than double, whether it be finding all the gaps, clearing a specific one, extra collectibles, and finding loose cash instead of point tokens. Therefore, it takes longer to clear everything, and along with everyone returning from the predecessor, there are 3 additional skaters to choose from. According to Tony Hawk, he got endless calls from skaters begging him to appear in the sequel, and who can blame them? It was out of his hand, basically. But at least if they were only allowed to pick 3 more, I like to think they got it right. I've already talked about how you can spend money on tricks and editing the button inputs. It's also used to buy stats and skateboards, unlike the first game that progressed the skater automatically. As you can see, I don't care much for the lip stat. The only time you really used the lip trick was in Philadelphia trying to find all the skate park spots, and I'll get to this soon, finding every single gap in every level. And I do mean every single one. A minor change having more control over your progress and more than one outfit for each skater, and that's another aspect that provides extra freedom of choice since stat types have increased in variety and really do make a difference. Like compare Tony Hawk and Rodney Mullen for example. In fact, the only step back I notice here is not being able to change the color of the skateboard wheels, which they brought back in the sequel anyway. And if you think 10 skate parks aren't enough, as you just saw before, you can also create your own skate parks and skateboarders. Going back to the story of my cousin's PS1, one of the other really early memories I had was making almost the whole park a spike pit. And I don't know how I considered this fun. I think this is what it looks like. Maybe it was a challenge we had, seeing how many times we can go back and forth without falling in the pit. Maybe, but there you are. Yeah, exactly that. Sure, a lot of these creator-thons are incredibly primitive by today's standards, like trying to put as many vibrant colors on a skater. Camo outfits were the only option. His name is Timmy, by the way, who was an old attempt at a mascot on the first year of my channel. Whenever I needed to make a custom character that symbolized the ColourShed logo, wow, it's good to finally see him again. But anyway, it's all primitive, but considering you didn't get any of these options in the predecessor, this was another radical feature which further increased the replay value. And with the park editor, for example, the tools and scenery you have at your disposal, the controls in terms of navigating through them and accidentally deleting something, it takes a bit of getting used to. Otherwise, a good way to understand level design and a good learning curve for the later titles in which the park editor and those are more complicated. It's like anything in life. Even the split-screen multiplayer has a few extra game modes, including tag, where the person who's it moves faster, so it can get pretty intense. However, like the predecessor, in multiplayer most of the levels are shrunken down, the draw distance is shorter, and the frame rate is a little choppy. But all of it is understandable given the technical limitations of the hardware at the time. Using the PlayStation version, graphically I never brought up how the predecessor looks because it was the first in the series and I didn't think about it that much since gameplay has and always will be the largest draw of the franchise. What's the term I'm looking for? Jagged lines, warping, and short draw distance? They're obvious in the predecessor. In fact, that would be a perfect way to describe any typical 3D PlayStation 1 game. Not in a bad way, I think there's a certain charm to that look that makes PS1 games so nostalgic. But comparing it with Pro Skater 2, this looks a lot better. This was when PS1 games from the early 2000s, just before the next generation was creeping in, developers really tried to make their games as polished as possible. Like if you compare sequels to their predecessor graphically, you'll see what I mean. Everything looks more rounded. And Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 was no exception. It obviously looks better on the PC or Sega Dreamcast. There's even an Xbox version which includes all the levels from the first game and a couple of bonus ones. Almost like what a Tony Hawk's 1+2 remaster would look like in 2001. But whenever I think of Pro Skater 2, it'll always be a CD running inside a PlayStation, the one actually developed by Neversoft. This was also before developers designed the levels around the arcade gameplay, when their intention was to design almost believable looking places, replicating as many iconic locations of a city it's based on, as well as popular skate parks and spots, all within the technical limits of the console. I always knew this, but looking at real life images of the locations the game bases off, it's pretty cool. Even Skate Heaven is just a food blended mix of iconic skate locations put together like Lego in outer space. There's a good chance that if you visit these locations for the first time in real life, you'll instantly think of a Tony Hawk game. At least that's how I felt when I went to Bondi Beach in Sydney for the first time because I played Underground 2 beforehand. I'm not kidding. I mean, you're clearly thinking skate park the second you enter these levels. It just doesn't look as obvious. And gameplay wise, they work well enough based on the controls. And even though they're roughly the same size, when you compare these levels to the predecessor, there are more ramps and pipes to skate on and more interactive with the way you can find or trigger secret areas. You almost get the sense it was designed to punish for an easy mistake. Even now, there are a few spots where I might clear it on the first attempt, but could also take a few minutes, like the $250 note on top of the statue in New York, clearing the long Venice Beach gap, or draining the fountain in Philly. I call these the grrr spots, where every time I succeed feels like a fluke, and I usually do these things first in the career mode. That's also another part of what makes these games classics. I usually have a semi-locked pathway of completing these goals as fast as possible without even needing to look at the goal list on the loading screen. Everybody has their own way of completing it, and there's no such thing as the wrong way. For some, that might set a poor impression, doing the same thing with over a dozen skaters just to unlock Skate Heaven. It certainly demonstrates confidence from the developers, depending on the gameplay being good enough to not feel repetitive. One thing I forgot to mention about the predecessor is how replaying the whole thing, redoing the same challenges nearly a dozen times with each skater, it got incredibly tiresome after a while that by the time I played the last few skaters, I was inevitably playing the game even worse because I just wanted to get it over with. But like the predecessor, you get a huge drive of excitement whenever you 100% all goals and cash in one go, or complete a goal or two after the timer runs out and you're still in a combo. And with the manual, you get a much higher chance to finish that last bit after the buzzer. And yet it also goes both ways. It's the worst thing in the world if you don't, even if you did well in the whole 2-minute run. I know I brought this fact up in the predecessor's review, but it's the sort of thing that can only be understood by those who put hundreds of hours into these games, and is one of the many reasons why Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is a masterpiece. And another important motivator is what you can unlock if you complete the whole thing with a Pro Skater. Like the predecessor, completing the career mode, earning all medals unlocks a Bales video, and all gold unlocks a video with the Pro Skater you just played the game with. But 100% doesn't just get you busted by Officer Richard. You can unlock so much more than that, including cheat codes and your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
Tony Hawk! Hey, I skated with that guy.
A time when something like this wasn't just a microtransaction. It was beautiful, especially moon physics and disco lights. Those were my favorite cheats back in the day. However, the inclusion of Spider-Man. Now, today I understand why he's in Pro Skater 2. Spider-Man was the game Neversoft made between both Tony Hawk titles. But as a kid, I don't know, I thought it was one of the coolest things ever. Instead of swinging all around the tall buildings of Manhattan, he's skating on the ground with only a few taxi drivers to witness the surprise. And his specials gave you a lot of points too. I wonder why he isn't in the 2020 remaster, at least as a PlayStation 4 exclusive. Imagine the suits that you can wear while skating. It's basically another gameplay aspect taken from the fighting genre, secret characters and cheats, and works perfectly with this one. And this was before the days when I didn't even have internet and found all these cool secrets simply through word of mouth from family and friends. Things like secret areas, skating around the bull ring to find the rest of the cash, the jetpack cheat, which for some reason I thought 100% in the entire game using this cheat was fun, or trying to unlock Private Carrera by finding every gap in every level. Yeah, I can never do the latter. Kudos to anyone that did without any walkthroughs. At the end of the day though, for a video game you can technically beat in less than an hour, it's so pump-filled with content that it'll definitely keep you occupied for way longer than that. Neversoft took a lot of drastic steps, but it's still simple enough that you can pick it up and play, and of course hard to master. I know that because it's exactly what I went through as a kid. The thought of 250,000 points in 2 minutes was ungodly, and after years of experience, now I can easily score that number of points in one combo. This review would have been very different had I not played it all those decades ago. When you think about it, you can say that about most of the Tony Hawk titles in the series, but Pro Skater 2 made the largest leap forward from a predecessor in terms of gameplay mechanics, and has aged well enough that despite the revert not being introduced until the next title in the series, it's still fun to play to this day. I think that's where the insanely high critic scores came from back then, and why gamers went crazy when the remaster was first announced. The first Pro Skater title was considered Game of the Year material back in 1999, creating a new genre in the process. And this one comes in and improves on literally every aspect possible, and setting off a long chain of other action sports. There's no other way of putting it. Maybe there were too many instances where my nostalgia was clouding my judgment. In every aspect, the custom skater, custom park, secrets, gameplay, all that stuff, I have a story to tell. It can be its own video. But let's be honest, there are a lot who feel the same way. It provides all the satisfying feelings you get out of classic video games, like getting the highest score, the pressure of completing something at the last second, finding the quickest way to clear the goals, all the secret unlockables and areas to discover. And when you combine that with the improved controls, graphics, and another iconic iconic soundtrack, this is a timeless masterpiece that stands up there with the best of the PS1 classics. So pick this up along with a skateboard and skate on, my son.